SCVs, probes, drones, S tier. And honestly, a ridiculous question, because without them, the entire rest of this list of silly units is completely irrelevant. If you don't have minerals, if you don't have Vespene gas, you can't build any of these units of any tier. But the S tier are going to be filled with things that pretty much no matter what, no matter how many you have, you're going to want more. Just like likes and subscribes here on YouTube. And Jimmy, what are we... Yeah, it's a tier list. No, I'm not desperate. It's content. 1,345 likes on this video. I'll do another one. Probably not a tier list for a while. It is kind of low energy content. But thank you for watching. Hopefully you've had a good day so far, and hopefully you're ready to have some strong opinions. As it's 2024, we've had some balance changes in StarCraft 2 over the last couple years. I'll do a quick once-over of any units that have gotten major changes, but we're going to be judging units based on their usefulness in the current professional meta, especially in non-mirror matchups. Because as fun as the Clown Fiesta that is Protoss versus Protoss, or Zerg versus Zerg, or the chess boxing match of TVT is, the units facing off against one another is what most people are interested in, and I'm here for the people. So, Adept. A-. I did a little hemming and hawing. I spent several minutes thinking about what the tiers should be. And remember, StarCraft 2 is all about it depends. Like, is this unit good at this time in this matchup? So we're going to generalize. And your opinions may differ, but at the end of the day, it's all engagement. So make sure to leave a comment. The Adept is very good at its role of worker harassment. All right? Now, it isn't good at fighting in a straight-up army. It's just a worse Zealot with more range, but not enough to really be a backline option. It finds its way into the early game of almost every Protoss situation, but drops off significantly. So it's our first unit in the A- tier, which is a unit that's very good for a narrow window of time. And once we pass that, it may drop off either entirely or significantly. Because you can build Adepts into your later game army. You just probably shouldn't. Unlike the Archon, which, because of its clear weaknesses of having to be in intimate loving in near melee range of units, as well as taking up so much physical space despite having no legs, the Archon is our first resident of the A tier. And we'll call it the A for Archon tier. Oh yeah, by the way, we're going to put units in order by race of how good they are in that tier. So I thought about doing like all the units in order, like left to right, and how good they are, but that gets real convoluted real fast. So we're going to separate them as we usually do in tournaments by race. YouTube, please don't demonetize me out of context. The auto turret. So we have a few buildings in here, mostly buildings that have combat potential in some fashion or another. So they are worthy of note. The auto turret is pretty good. The auto turret has been nerfed several times, though. The Raven now has to be within one range to drop it down essentially directly underneath. It can kill a decent amount of workers, but it's kind of a filler ability, as opposed to the almost permanent terror of Wings of Liberty back when it was like 3-4 minutes, something ridiculous. But the red-headed stepchild of the missile turret is pretty good, but certainly isn't the best of the, or most impactful of the Raven abilities most of the time. So, B tier. Mostly because it's effectively free, just costs energy. The Baneling. Now, the Baneling has been nerfed multiple times. In fact, let's go on over to Liquipedia here. For units like this, I want to make sure I get it right, because otherwise people are going to debate numbers. So, the damage of the Baneling has been changed to, well, has less with +2 upgrades, as well as having no health bonus with Baneling speed, which is centrifugal hooks. So, having 30 instead of 35 HP, as well as no longer one-shotting probes or doing as much damage to Marines, I think has put the Baneling in kind of a weird spot, where it can be very good, but it can also be a massive waste of Vespene gas. I think before the nerfs, thanks, Cyril, it may have been a solid 8-tier unit, but right now it's also a way to throw away a whole lot of your money, potentially doing effectively nothing. So the Baneling, no longer on the pedestal it once was, but still a very strong unit as like a late-game battering ram. The Banshee. Oh, the Banshee. The Banshee is... We're putting it in the seat that it's not going to be there. That's just until we decide. So the Banshee is not usually a part of any sort of army composition. Like, they're occasionally in Terran versus Zerg. It can find its way with the Hyperflight, which has been buffed multiple times. Or just having Cloaked Banshees in general. Like, much like the Adept, it has value at almost all times in the early game, but unlike the Adept, it continues to be valuable in the later game. Which, we're just going to go with how they show up in the game, which is Terran, Zerg, Protoss, in that order. And that's usually how many tournaments without Cyril go as well. But the Banshee, I think, because it extends past that early game. Now, remember, we're talking about professional players. Players with 4 times URI's AP. Okay, not quite that much APM, but 300, 400 APM players who can make use of Banshees without banking 1,500 minerals at home. So that is the key point here. I'm mostly thinking of Clem and his Banshee usage, but Gumiho and Oliveira both get a lot of mileage out of the Banshees. I wonder if they get anything back for that. But that brings us to the Battlecruiser, which, well, it's still amazing. In my opinion, any unit that is weaker in campaign or co-op than it is in multiplayer is a bit ridiculous. But the reason the Battlecruiser isn't a staple is because there are better, cheaper options that don't have such direct counters. A fleet of Battlecruisers will still carry you all the way into the GSL. It's just not the most common option because it can be countered when it is predicted. So since we're on the professional level here, I think we got to put the Battlecruiser in the B tier, though it pains me, because the further down you go, I think like every 200 MMR you drop below Cyril, it goes up a tier, which means by the time you get to mid-Grandmaster, it's at S. But the Battlecruiser is kind of situational right now. There are better options, like the Banshee, especially against Protoss. So it doesn't really find its way into even Terran versus Terran, except in some very niche late game scenarios. So I don't even think it quite serves the role of being the Baneling and the Adept are the best at their particular jobs. There's no better option for Protoss or Zerg. There are better options for Terran to fill that kind of air control and air superiority role, though none in the late game. So B tier it stays. The Broodlord. Oh, the Broodlord. I think the Broodlord is going to need some patch changes here. I mean, we're going to need to read them out, as there's been several. Move speed dramatically increased. And by dramatically, I mean about 10%. But spawn broodling duration, thanks Dark, nerfed as well. By almost half. Like 2/3, but wait, that's not how math works. Anyways, moving on. So what Dark was doing, and other Zergs to a lesser extent, was broodling cannibalization. When you attacked your own broodlings to spawn more broodlings, creating even more range for the broodlings, and essentially having 2 waves off of 1 wave. Yes, it was very micro-intensive, but it was very effective in the late game. And then, again, so patch 5.0.11 is pretty... Any patch past 5.0 is the Balance Council, as opposed to the Blizzard, official Blizzard patch. I mean, these are official patches, but they're directed by the Balance Council of pro players and concerned individuals as opposed to the Balance team at Blizzard. David Kim, if you haven't heard, is now working on a new game. You can find my video on that. I've got some strong opinions, and I'll be showing them off, but I digress. So the Broodlord is a lot closer to the Guardian of Brood War nowadays than it is to the Broodlord that menaced Wings of Liberty. Another key point that I think a lot of people kind of forget is they no longer have the range. Their leash range is now 9. You can kind of gimmick it a little bit, but that means they easily get in range of Thors, of most air units, before they're able to launch their Broodlings down. And the Broodlings themselves are weaker. They last less time. So the Broodlord has gotten whipped with the Nerf bat several times over, barely flying along. I think that puts it in the B tier, where it works in niche scenarios, but the B tier is all about units that are good in some scenarios, but are rarely the best option, or are just so late game that you need a huge investment to make them very valuable. So the Broodlord has been relegated there for somewhat different reasons than the Battlecruiser, but I think it's going to be chilling there for a while. The bunker. The bunker, you get a 75 mineral restocking fee. Still incredibly good. Hasn't had its build time increase for quite a while. I think it goes in the situational column. It does its job great. Put it in Clem's hands with those silly SCVs. It's not so great in the later game, as the amount of space it takes up usually doesn't justify just jamming down supply depots in order to make sure those Zerglings don't get through. Is the superior option, but overall, the bunker still in a pretty good spot, especially if you put it in a good spot. Carriers. Now carriers as well. All right. So the carrier has gotten some changes, some of which I agree with, and some of which have worked out kind of oddly. As you can see, the carrier has gone through... This is just Legacy of the Void you're seeing on the Wikipedia pages. Just FYI. Interceptor attack priority is reduced, which means if you're in range of other units, interceptors will not be targeted like units. Before, units generally will attack the threat closest to them. And for interceptors, that usually means they're flying around like bees. In this case, though, if you're close enough to the carrier instead of the interceptors, you can see this a lot with like Vikings, then they will target the carrier over the interceptor because the carrier is considered a larger threat. This is a good and bad. It's a buff nerf because to an extent you can keep your interceptors alive longer, but it's a nerf in many scenarios where you're facing an overwhelming amount of units that, especially at the lower levels or just in the very complicated late game fights. I think overall this has ended up being a nerf to the carrier. Not that it's really changed its role that dramatically, but I can't remember. We're at the professional level. The carrier is still the ultimate late game for Protoss. So the A tier isn't necessarily units that are amazing, but are the best at that role. And the carrier as an ultimate late game unit for Protoss, I'm hard pressed. I'm going to put it in the A tier, below the Archon, because the Archon is clearly no question in my mind. But it may not stay there. But my initial placement is A. Changeling from the Overseer, kind of amused that we have this here, is pretty good. It can be very good. I'm gonna give it an A- because it just costs energy on the Overseer. So like, the Changeling is something that players like Cyril use to great effect. Rarely will you see it be a game changer, as players are very good Oh yeah, pro tip, by the way. You can just right-click on Changelings. You don't have to A-click. You know how many years it was before I knew that? Too many. Too many of my own Marines shot in the back. The Colossus. The Colossus has found more of a place lately. It's been getting mixed into both Protoss versus Terran and Zerg compositions. Not en masse, but it's kind of a core part. I think it makes it into the situation column. As, I mean, I'm not sure we had any major changes. We've kind of gone back and forth on the Colossus. Yeah. There hasn't been really any patch notes, but the Colossus is no longer the fearsome turret platform of old. Quite a while ago, it was changed to have a significant amount of bonus damage versus light, which didn't overall increase it at the cost of a reduction. I mean, we can just look here. So, does 10 plus 5 versus light. So, it's still pretty good, and considering it does 2 attacks, means that each attack needs those upgrades, but extended thermal lance also critical. It takes a lot to make it work, which is why it's situational. Obviously, there are many scenarios that you don't want the Colossus, or it feels almost... it feels like a liability, especially like against those late-game sort of Terran compositions, or against Vipers for Zerg. So that is why it's a unit that fills that mid-game role real well, and then almost literally just drops off a cliff as they're ready to counter it. Now the Corruptor, the Proto-Broodlord. Oh, the Corruptor. The only real dedicated anti-air unit in the game. I guess the Phoenix as well. It has Caustic Spray versus buildings, which is one of the clunkiest abilities to use. It's vulnerable to many of the things it counters. It does extra damage to massive units in the air, but is an armored unit itself, which means it takes bonus damage from things like Vikings, technically Void Rays if you ever see them, Stalkers. So a lot of the things that are very common in unit compositions will help counter the Corruptor, which is why I almost want to put it in C tier, because nobody likes having to build Corruptors. Okay? Like, it's not even... It's good at what it does, which is killing carriers and battlecruisers and Tempests. I have to put it in the B tier. I think because it is the best option. Hydras aren't really anti-air against any sort of comprehensive composition. And, yeah, it's not so many games, too many games, arguably. Even at the top tier, you see a player overcommit to Corruptors, and even if they do end up going Broodlords, just not having any anti-ground potential, as 10 Broodlords aren't necessarily going to wipe out an army in the way that, like, carriers or battlecruisers might. Now, the Cyclone. Now, the Cyclone, we ought to have a whole discussion. All right? The Cyclone has gone through so many identity crises that said the Cyclone originally started out as a long-range kind of sniper unit. And then in like 2017 or so, it turned into like a machine gun turret, firing off rocket pods. Like, you don't even want to open these up, as there's been more balance changes here. Okay, and just in the Balance Council era. So, the Cyclone as it is now, where we've landed, you don't need the whole history, but it is now a spammable kind of wannabe Goliath. A lot of Terran mech is just wishing they had a Goliath. And the Cyclone now fulfills this fantasy of a mediocre mech unit. In the previous patch, up till the beginning of this year, it was a menace, where the lock-on had no cooldown, so it essentially was like a better Phoenix. It does bonus damage to mechanical. You can build it out of a reactor. It costs the same amount as a Stalker, 125.50. And also hard counters Stalkers because it can attack while moving and has that bonus to mechanical. But with it got toned down in the most previous patch, where the lock-on now is a cooldown. Not a long one, but a cooldown. And its health was increased, but DPS reduced. So the effect of this is it's no longer nearly as useful against Zerg, which has a lot of things like Zerglings, that before was surprisingly good against, because with no cooldown, it would just lock on, lock on, lock on. But now has kind of... It fills the niche of early game anti-air support unit. You see it quite often in early game Terran versus Protoss and Terran versus Terran. So it's either be... Honestly, it is the best at its role of an early game mech unit that is helpful for dealing with anti-air and supporting early pushes. But it drops off dramatically, both because it's literally so large that it kind of gets in the way of your army, and it is not particularly cost effective when you could be building other things like siege tanks, or to an extent Hellions or Widowmons. The Dark Templar. B. So, and the only reason it's not C tier is because Dark Templar can become Archons, which is a bit odd to be factoring that particular aspect in, but I think it is relevant because many builds involve getting Dark Templar early, and then, like, against Zerg especially, and then morphing them, merging them into Archons. So we have to factor that in. But they are unwieldy. Their blink was nerfed, so that way there's a cooldown afterwards. This was an attempt to nerf them against, planetary fortresses, but serves to just make them feel clunky and doesn't really change that interaction. So the Dark Templar is currently your surprise. Do you have detection or DT drop build? But unfortunately, it is not the most amazing there. The DTs have been left behind. The fact that you need a different building than the Templar archives as well. In the building, Dark Shrine takes quite a while, twice as long as the Templar archives, and costs 150. It makes it very hard to just kind of have Dark Templar, so they are relegated to this mediocre role. The Disruptor. So, we're talking about the top professional level, where the Disruptor is one of the most polarizing units out there, as it can win games in a single shot or lose them after missing 10. I think it is still the best option, as MaxPax has shown especially, at dealing with the late game Terran Bioball, Ghost, stuff like that, but is inherently unreliable. I think it has to go with the A tier because there are a few better options. So it is up there as a choice, but it is hard to rate. Like, depending on who you ask, the Disruptor is the best unit in the game, or just a tool you're forced into using. But I think it's still a solid choice, but needs to be supported, much like many Protoss power units, by a better, or at least a meatier army composition to protect it. So A tier, fine, but also some pretty big caveats there. Unlike for this unit, the Ghost. Just because the game got canceled doesn't mean this unit has been. It's gone through several nerfs, which have not really seen its usage go down, as enhanced shockwaves removed, but EMP radius has been reduced to 1.5. For reference, that's slightly larger than a Disruptor shot. And also, steady targeting is canceled if the unit moves far enough away, which is really only realistic against Zerg on creep in most scenarios, if they're close enough. Steady targeting can now be manually canceled, as well as snipe damage was reduced to not quite one-shot Roaches and Zealots, this has had very little effect. It's still 2 shots Broodlords, 1 shots Infestor, stuff like that. The Ghost is, until you stop seeing, I don't think it requires too much explanation, but it is the ultimate late game unit against both Protoss and Zerg. It almost deserves its own tier, as this is the unit. If you had to choose one unit, we're not including SCVs here, against Protoss, like if Zerg or Protoss could ban a single unit in the game when they're playing their opponent, it would be the Ghost. I don't think it would be the Ghost twice before it would be any other unit, for many, many reasons. But the Ghost is incredible. It fills a necessary role, and it fills it uncomfortably well in many cases. And this is demonstrated by the very top Terrans in quite dramatic ways. So, no doubt in my mind, we have our first non-worker S tier unit. And it's definitely not the Hellbat. So, Hellbat's still solid. And since the armory cost, so this is kind of a tangential thing. The armory cost was reduced to only 50 gas as a part of a balancing out of a Widowmine nerf. But so getting Hellbats is easier than ever, and that has seen them added into many unit compositions, especially against Zerg, never against Protoss. So I think the lack of Hellbats for anything against, now they're very good at their role, but they're not. You don't go for Hellbats, except in either late game or, you usually have Hellions. I was thinking about B, but actually, now that I talk it out, they're in the A- situational tier. In that early game push timing with siege tanks and marines, and then in the ultimate late game as a mineral sink to buffer against Broodlords and Zerglings, the Hellbat serves its role really well. But outside of those situations, it's usually not nearly as effective. All right, the Hellion. Also in the same zone here, I'm going to put it actually a little ahead of the Hellbat, because you do see Hellions both against Terran and against Protoss, and of course against Zerg. So all 3 matchups. But they either live long enough to become Hellbats or die a villain. The choices are they run in and try to kill workers or defend like very early game units, and then they either live to become Hellbats or they're dead, and then we move on. So the Hellion, from similar timings as the Hellbat, very good at that role, and not much outside it, as they're easily countered once you have some Roaches or Stalkers or whatever. High Templar. Alright, now, once again, factoring in that High Templar can become Archons. Storm is amazing, but High Templar are very expensive. At 150 gas a pop, yeah, they got their water balloons. Getting Storm is another 200 gas, and Storm isn't guaranteed to kill anything in particular. Even with all that said, I think the High Templar is still barely. I think it makes it past situational, because it's not situational. You always want High Templar. You just can't always afford it. But it's a critical part. You pretty much can't play endgame Protoss without them. But since there's such clear counters and the expense, it's not an S tier unit. It's not I want 20 of these. I want 4 with full energy. And I want to spread them out because ghosts exist. Or Banelings, etc., etc. So they go up there with the Disruptor, with the Carrier, with the Archon as these strong late game units. Now the Hydra. Oh, the Hydra. I go back and forth on the Hydra all the time. It's... The reason you don't see Hydras all the time is the startup cost, much like High Templar. Getting a Hydra dead, getting the Hydra upgrades, it's a relatively fragile unit, at only 85 HP. I always get it wrong. Let me make sure. Which is an important breakpoint. 90 HP. I knew it. I knew I would be wrong. I didn't know if it was 90 or 85 nowadays. Yeah. Where the upgrades keep going back and forth. They're quite microable. They don't quite die to a single Liberator hit. They will get killed by Snipe or Disruptors, so they're vulnerable to splash damage. But they can also become Lurkers, which are a very good unit. I think the Hydra is a solid A-tier unit, as it stands. Well, slithers, really. It doesn't have legs, but it's a healthy part of any imbalanced breakfast, where part of a core composition where okay, I'm kind of rambling here. I can even hear it, which is a bad sign. The Hydra against Terran and the Hydra against Protoss can be a core part of any composition. It's not always the choice, but when you need like range support damage, especially in the mid game, the Hydra is that choice. And even into the later game much of the time, as you're not exclusively going Lurkers with it. The Immortal is amazing. It has very clear weaknesses, but there's almost never a scenario where the Immortal, having more Immortals is going to be bad. Both against Terran and Zerg, though more commonly against Zerg, also against Protoss. Throwing that one in, but the Immortal, top tier unit. Not the toppest tier just because of all the counters, which are mostly swarms of smaller units, whether they're Marines, Zerglings, or Zealots. They're not quite as good, but they're a great core of any army, so a solid A tier. The Infestor. Okay, well, here we are. The Infestor has, thanks, Cyril, but... So, Infestors now start with 75 energy, but Fungal Growth has less range. Well, it was eventually unnerfed, but Fungal Growth doing less damage is quite important. So, a Marine with Combat Shield has 55 HP. Fungal Growth, when it does 30 damage, kills it in 2 hits, whereas 25 damage does not. And obviously that adds up over every unit on the field, especially against Terran, but also to a lesser extent against Protoss, but this is mostly a significant nerf to a Terran versus Zerg interaction. So the Infestor actually had 10 vision range underground. For reference, that was more than a pylon, which is kind of ridiculous, actually. Got the unburrow time was nerfed by a significant margin. And so part of the reason why burrowing and unburrowing felt kind of weird, for those wondering, is there was a significant random delay. Now, almost every unit in the game has this. That's why units feel so natural, is there's a range. Like, even Marines, they don't attack every 1 second, placeholder number. They attack between 0.98 and like 1.03 seconds. And that's why, if you just let them attack for 5-6 seconds, it looks like they're all firing differently. They're not like archers in AoE 4, which are all linked to the collective Mongolian hive mind and all fire at the exact same house at the same time. No. So this random delay is what, well, partially a balance thing. And also partially to make units feel natural. But this was reduced towards the upper end, which means almost always will the Infestor take longer to unburrow. And that extra split second is a big difference unless you position those Infestors well, which is harder with the vision range reduced so dramatically. So, despite all this, the Infestor is still an A-tier unit, as it's almost required in many scenarios. It's still very good at its job. Neural Parasite is amazing. It takes a lot of... I'm not even putting it on situational because it's just good. It's just good. It's no longer everything amazing, make 5,000 infested Terrans. Yes, Zerg Marines were still the late game counter, but the Infestor is just a good unit. And the better you can use it, the better you're going to be. Oh, yeah, I forgot the order we were putting things in. And I'd put it as a more core unit even than the Hydra. Liberator. A unit that maps are literally designed around. The Liberator has actually been buffed. Kind of sneakily, in my opinion. But now, it had its advanced ballistics bonus range reduced to 2. So, no longer can they deny mineral patches from the next zip code. But believe me, this has not had much of an effect in their usage. But they also got a buff to reduce their gas costs by 25 last year, which has made it easier to mass up Liberators on a regular basis. Not that I think that made a huge difference in how often they're out there dispensing freedom, but it certainly doesn't hurt. So the Liberator is amazing at its job. And you're like, what is its job? And the answer is pretty much everything but killing building. Whether it's early game harass, or late game zone control, or late game attention dragging, I guess, with ranged Liberators shelling mineral lines, all you have to do is cover one mineral patch, and it works just fine. The Liberator, a very divisive unit, at least for me, but there's no denying how good it is, and especially evidenced by how often players build it. Clearly they agree. Now, the Lurker. The Lurker is very good, but also has very clear counters. Both Protoss and Terran, their A and S tier units here, can counter Lurkers with ease. The strength of the Lurker is how difficult it is to dislodge once it gets into position, but it isn't particularly great in a straight-up fight against an Immortal Templar composition, against Ghosts or Liberators, so it has to go into the A- situational tab, as Lurkers are a good choice in many scenarios, but certainly not all of them. And they're definitely not the I'm rushing Hive for Lurkers sort of. And notice how I say that as well? I didn't even think about it. But Lurkers before Hive are terrible. So the situation is you need to get to Hive. Technically, you can build them before that, but without their range and without their speed, or at least their... let's make sure we get the exact notes here. Without their burrow speed, which they nerfed to not have speed. Without their range and without their burrow speed, they're just target practice for most army compositions. I'd say before Hive, Lurkers are a unit that you can build it, but any other unit would have probably worked as well if Lurkers are winning before Hive. So it is situational. It requires those upgrades, but can be very good if you get into the right spot. Marauders, amazing. They're just good. I mean, I don't think we need to talk too much about these next three units, which are conveniently in a direct line. So we'll talk about them together. Marine Marauder Medivac has been good for 14 years and is still good. That will never not be true. The Marauder, just because it doesn't shoot up, goes into the A tier, though it is amazing at its job of killing armored units and isn't bad as just like a core army composition unit. It still has very good DPS. And concussive shells has ridiculous utility. The Marine is arguably the best unit in the game if the Ghost didn't exist. It is by far the strongest tier 1 unit, especially when combined with the Medivac, which allows you to both heal and boost around the map faster than pretty much anything but a Muta or a Phoenix. So, and also the Medivac no longer has the Afterburners upgrade, but it recently regained the Caduceus Reactor upgrade, which allows it to up its Medivac energy regen by double. So you don't even need as many Medivacs with your army in the later game, though, in my opinion, not enough players utilize this. Not enough players are as smart as Gumiho. But it's a clear, solid late game option. All right, now we're into some odd ones. I think we're going to go a bit out of order here, because we're going to address all the buildings. Because we only had one building so far, if you don't count the auto turret, which I'm not going to. But the Orbital Command is S tier. Until you show me a game where a Terran gets to 200 supply or near 200 supply and doesn't start building 5 more command centers for orbitals, having map hacks and not needing as many SCVs. Sorry, SCVs. In fact, the orbital goes before workers because it creates better workers. Those workers are replaced by automation. And also, it gives you instantaneous, uncounterable map hacks. And also, it builds SCVs. So, and it flies, by the way. Just throwing that in there. It's probably the best building in the game. And while it doesn't have direct combat potential, scan, and to an extent MULEs are clearly some... Oh yeah, it can also drop supply depots, but that's usually irrelevant because the command center itself is worth almost 15 supply, so just under. The Nexus is included here. For some reason, there's no hatchery, but the hatchery doesn't have any abilities that affect a fight. It has upgrades, but the Orbital Command has scan and to an extent MULEs. The Nexus has overcharge, as well as recall, which are just simply not as good. It also has chrono boost to an extent, but overcharge is good, but it creates the weak point of the shield battery. So you do kind of need the shield battery, which will go... Nope, that's not a shield battery, though wish it was. Which will go alongside it. The problem is that units like the Liberator and the Widowmine just kind of ignore shield batteries. Shield batteries have very little HP, so they can be shot down quite easily, and overcharge is on a pretty decent cooldown. So, as well as recall having such a long cast animation, it's a important tool, but by no means does it feel like a massive game changer, as if units are caught out of position, you will lose many of them before the recall completes. Now, Spine. The Spine is not... I'm not going to die on this hill. I'll get off this hill and move along, but the Spine should get melee upgrades. Alright, that Impaler Tentacle, the Spine Crawler, it costs you a drone to build Zerg buildings. So you're spending a drone, so you're spending the cost of a cannon here, 150. Plus all the things, all the time that drone could be mining. For something that doesn't even reliably kill 2 zealots. Like, the Spine Crawler is good because there's nothing else that Zerg has that's static defense. Though Queens exist, so I would kind of count that. So, it's just... It's the best, and it's not good. You build a bunch of them because they don't cost supply, but they are simply not particularly great. And I think this is somewhat controversial, but the cannon is only an A-. The cannon does not have much utility in general. Like, it's 150 minerals, it's relatively squishy, you can't overcharge it. Maybe next patch? I doubt it. That'd be a buff to Protoss. But cannon rushing is not a particularly... Occasionally you'll see it, but at the highest level, it's in very niche scenarios and usually only on specific maps. It's just not that dangerous. And it's countered... Okay, so here's the reason why the cannon, as well, is not so great in the later game, is both Terran and Zerg have a lot of ways to exploit buildings that are close to each other. Whether it's EMP and siege tanks, more siege tanks than EMP, or Banelings and corrosive bile, Protoss gets punished for putting buildings too close to each other, because you can kill 2, 3, 4 buildings at once with these abilities and these units. So Protoss is forced to spread out their defenses, which kind of mitigates the effectiveness overall. So that's why cannons can be good, but they aren't the be-all, end-all. I think turrets are just good. They're only 100 minerals. They can be repaired. They have... I don't know if they have the most range. So, let's see. Missile turret. So, they start with 7 range, and then you can get high-sec auto-tracking, which brings them to 8. The Spore has 7 range, and the Cannon, 7 range. So, it is the longer, potentially longest range. And just based on the amount you see, especially compared to dedicated anti-air from the other races, The Spore suffers from the same issues, which are costing a drone. You have to build them, but usually you have to build them in your mineral line as well, which kind of delays. Now, the same is true for the cannons, and to an extent missile turrets, so it's not a big difference. But the Spore Crawler is, you need this. You don't want to build it, but it's the best option. So here we are. Do we have any more buildings? Oh, the Planetary Fortress is maybe a bit controversial with the Battlecruiser here. Bronze League Hero is going to be very upset. B tier. It doesn't fly. It doesn't have mules. It doesn't have great damage. It's mostly used to draw aggro and force an engagement. But a planetary, especially, like, you don't build nearly as many planetaries as orbitals. It's very good, but it's not something you're spamming out there when you could be building better options. So it serves its purpose without going overboard. I think that might make it situational, but eh. Oh yeah, put the Lurker over there. Mothership. So the Mothership, okay. I even saw some comments the last time we saw one show up in a game, but the Mothership has gone through almost as much of an identity crisis as the Cyclone. So it currently has 3 abilities. Cloaking Field. It no longer passively cloaks. It's an activatable ability. Mass Recall, which recalls units to the Mothership in a large radius. And Time Warp, which slows attack and movement speeds. I think we've gone back and forth on attack or movement. It does attack as well? I didn't know that. I wasn't sure about that. Doesn't say it here, but I'm not 100% on it reducing attack speed. But if it does, that's a big deal. 60-second cooldown. So it no longer has energy, which means EMP no longer affects it, besides wiping out its kind of minimal shields. It's smaller, which is a bit sad. Costs less supply, though, and less resources, down to 300. So I think it is more usable than it was before. In fact, I think it's a bit underutilized at the moment, especially in the late game. We're seeing more and more players use it as a more tactical option. It costs less than a carrier. And overall, 350, 250 for a carrier, but you also have to buy the interceptors consistently, and you don't really need upgrades. The Mothership hits like a bunch of pool noodles with its laser beams, but still. All right, and now the Mule. So I'm at A- on the Mothership. It's probably B, but I feel even most pro players are still kind of underutilizing it, as it shouldn't be with the main army. It should be a defensive option that doesn't cost as much supply as warping around a Zealot. It's kind of like the Mothership core of old. So the Mule replaces workers, especially SCVs. So clearly it's better than them. That's where it goes. I mean, it comes from the Orbital, which is the most toppest tier building, so. The Muta. Very simply, there's too many counters, and the Muta's too expensive. Spire takes too long to build. Rarely do you see Mutas outright. They can win in certain scenarios, but they're certainly not a core unit. They're not a common unit composition. I don't think they're quite C tier, but they go with the other Zerg Spire units, and they can work, but there's usually better options. Nidus. We're just assuming this also means the Nidus network. The Nidus has seen a dramatic uptick in use from both Serral and Dark, the top 2 Zergs, though we might have a debate on who's rating them. So I think the Nidus, I probably would have put it at B tier not too long ago. It hasn't really gotten significant changes. But the Nidus network, yeah, I don't believe it's gotten any changes from the Balance Council. It's just been used for a lot of backstabbing and early pushes and all those things lately. Oh, here we are. Ah, yes. You get a little bit more creep when it pops out because now, because queens can only transfuse on creep. I'm willing to... All right. No. We need a new tier here. What have we done? The best unit in the game is the Queen. Now, why is that? It's because it is the only unit on this entire list that is irreplaceable, besides workers. Without the Queen, Zerg does not work. You don't have early defense. You don't have creep spread. You don't have enough larva. You don't have anti-air. You don't have late game healing. You like, just generally, without the Queen, there is nothing to fill it. You can go without making Marines to an extent. You can survive without Ghosts. You can make perfectly good Terran unit compositions without Marines, Medivacs, and Marauders. You can play Protoss without having, well, we haven't put all the units on the board yet, but there are plenty of compositions. But at the professional level, 95% of the time, especially games that end on not like a one-base proxy hatch, and even then, you will lose the game if you don't build queens. And it's not even really close. So, I bet you could even be fine without orbitals, though it would be quite painful. But the Queen, for better or worse, is required for Zerg. And a whole lot of them. Damn right! Brenda. The Queen has gotten a few nerfs overall. The main one being can no longer transfuse off creep because before players were just walking the Queens across. This has led to the rise of the German taxi build, the Soul Stroll, and a wide variety of just Nidus-based builds to get that creep across the map. But it makes it a little harder to use the Queen as an aggressive option, though certainly not impossible. The Queen is the best unit in the game, if only because the entire Zerg race would crumble without it. So, Observer is quite good. Now, I think, therefore I am, but the Oracle has to go first. The Oracle is an S tier unit. The Oracle gives you detection, stasis, and also can attack. There's a reason. It's a requirement in 90% of Protoss versus Zerg. It's not a requirement in the if you don't build it, you'll lose the game. But there's a reason you see it in like 90% of Protoss versus Zerg. At least a significant percentage of Protoss versus Terran, though not as common. And against Protoss itself, the Oracle is still a great tool. It might not be a core spammable unit, though it sometimes is, but it definitely, it's pretty much the best tool Protoss has for several different roles. And it's so common even in Protoss versus Zerg. I think it deserves that S tier slot, which is why the Observer is kind of, now, another bit controversial, but the Observer is B tier because it takes robo time and it costs a lot of gas. The Observer doesn't do anything that an Oracle and good scouting couldn't do better. The Observer fills its role just fine. You have to build it on a lot of occasions, but like you're not excited to be building a bunch of Observers. So it's fine, but it's not something you're hyped about having a bunch of. It's just a necessary, not quite evil, but expense. Kind of like the Sentry. Okay, all right. Back to the patch notes. The Sentry. Here we are. So, the Sentry builds faster. It moves faster. Guardian Shield is longer. But, and it's no longer a light unit, as well as doing more damage to shields, which is pretty obviously only affecting Protoss. But so the Sentry is required for Protoss. So I think it has to go in the A tier with all the other requirements. Like, you pretty much need the Sentry in any sort of later game army composition, and it's very helpful in the early game. Guardian Shield reduces all range damage to units within by 2. But it's kind of anti-synergistic in many ways, as this encourages you to stay near the Sentry, which makes you vulnerable to a whole lot of different things, from opposing Protoss's Disruptors, to Siege Tanks, to EMP, Banelings, Lurkers. So the Sentry, while providing a very important, and I'm not even counting Force Field as a thing, because 90% of the time against anything but Zerg, Force Field kind of just backfires. Hallucination is also very good for early scouting, which is why the Observer is in the B tier. So it's good, and it's not situational. Every situation could use a Sentry, but I'm not happy about it, because it's 100 gas, it has less range than a Stalker, so it sits in front of Stalkers and Immortals and proceeds to die immediately. So I propose a Sentry mode, where it sieges up and can cast all its abilities in that range, but doesn't walk forward and die because it has less range than a Stalker or Immortal. But maybe a battle for another day. So it's A tier only because it has to be. The Overlord. It can drop. It has tentacles. It's a great scouting tool. It's an A tier unit. It's an Overlord. You kind of need them. So it's kind of odd to even have on here, but I guess it's a combat unit. It's important, and it's cheap, and serves its purpose well. So honestly, the Overseer, I think, much like the Observer, is an expensive gas, and it takes away your Overlord. Where the amount of times we see games decided by Overseers getting picked off, it's easy to target and kill. Usually you need a bunch of them, because one is not going to be enough. Because it's not cloaked, and it's not really any tankier than an Overlord. So your detection is unreliable unless you have multiple, which inherently makes it kind of a weak unit. So I don't think it's a particularly core unit overall, but it is a necessary evil in many cases. The Phoenix. The Phoenix struggles because, one, you usually need Stargate time for other things. A lot of Protoss is defined by not so much the gateway units, but when you're building power units from anything but the gateway, usually, or Warp Gate, you have a limited amount of time, even with Chrono Boost, to get them on the field and make them useful. So the Phoenix, not so great against Zerg, because Queens exist and Oracles exist on different sides of it. Not so great against Terran, because Cyclones and Vikings and Ghosts, oh my. So it's okay against Protoss, but I think it gets relegated to that much more niche B tier nowadays, as it just is simply not as good as it once was. Now the Ravager. It's not going to stay there. The Ravager is a core part of most Zerg unit compositions. The ability to snipe off static emplacements and force your opponent to micro at all is a key part, which means it's not really quite situational. I think it has to go into the A tier, as you see it so often and used so well by the top players that, yeah. I was thinking about A-, but it's not really situational. You always find a use for Ravager, so it's just a solid unit. Just the Roach as well. The Roach is really bad, but it's designed to be really bad, and thus it's really cheap. So finds itself, and it becomes a Ravager. Another key part of all of it. The Raven. So the Raven, if you ask the YouTube comments, is heavily underutilized. It has gone through another half a dozen changes, probably since the last time you checked up on it. as can't go a single patch without it getting touched. But so the Raven is cheaper. It builds faster. It no longer has that starting energy upgrade. But auto turrets were nerfed. Interference matrix now requires research. It's 50-50, kind of like concussive shells does. And interference matrix can no longer target units already affected. So that helps with not accidentally casting 16 times on the same target. But the Raven, the problem is it requires a tech lab. Much like Phoenix is for Protoss, the Raven requiring a tech lab is more of an issue than you might think when theory crafting. So even with that said, though, it sees use in pretty much every matchup. More rare against Zerg, but not completely. Great against Protoss in many scenarios, and against Terran, it's almost required. So it's a solid situational choice. Now the Reaper. Okay, so this is an odd one. The Reaper is ridiculous. It still looks like Beyond should get it nerfed again sometimes. It's used in every single matchup. But once you get anywhere past tier 1 tech, once you get to something like more than one Stalker, it drops off dramatically. Though you'll still see some cute little builds. So I don't think it's quite... I almost want to put it in S tier, but because it's used in effectively every single game, but it's not a unit you're spamming, except in, once again, niche scenarios. But it can be ridiculous. It's the top of situational tier, in my opinion. It's the very best of units that are only used in a specific scenario, and it's so good at what it does. The Siege Tank. So first things, the Widowmine gets relegated. I almost want to put it in the B tier now. As the Widowmine, the menace of society, the proprietor of war crimes, the absolute worst unit to deal with as a noob, has finally been nerfed dramatically. And by nerfed dramatically, I mean it's much more visible when it's firing, has less splash damage, and requires drilling claws to be cloaked still. So significant nerfs across the board makes it way less annoying. And this has inspired Terrans to just lose horribly without... to build siege tanks, which is what we were getting to. Siege tanks, which haven't gone through any changes in many years and are still amazing, especially when the maps have such nice little locations to jam the siege tanks into. I'm sure you've seen some of that. So, both a combination of the Widowmine receiving a makeover with the nerf bat, and the Siege Tank is a solid. I think the Siege Tank is actually the top of the A tier. Even over the Marauder, as it overlaps with its role, and it continues to be strong. And especially since the armory is reduced in cost, it's easier to get there. Siege Tanks are used in every single matchup, sometimes throughout the entirety of the game. So, a solid core unit, only not S tier because it doesn't shoot up mostly. Like, in this case, it doesn't fill every role. I could see the Widowmine still being an A-, but honestly, even Clem, who was probably the most common user and abuser of the Widowmines, has embraced the Siege Tank as filling that kind of later game ranged role. And I think for good reason, as now the Widowmine just doesn't... We've kind of rediscovered that Siege Tanks are a very good unit. And that continues. Speaking of not-so-good units, the Stalker. The Stalker, I think... Okay, we're just going to do the quick version, which is it goes in A tier because it has to. There is no other anti-air unit from the Gateway. Don't even laugh. Don't even talk to me about sentries. Don't even talk to me about Archons. Blink Stalkers are great. They're used in every matchup all the time. They're incredibly fragile and are usually used to lose in every matchup, but they are a core unit, much like the Charge Lot. So, and that's a Charge Zealot. A non-Charge Zealot goes in the C tier. All right? But These are both units that are usually covering for the other great Protoss units up there. And don't scale nearly as well, but are still really, really good. And the best at their roles. There is no better mineral sink for Protoss. They don't have any other units. They can just build with only minerals. Zerg has Queens, which are, we've already established, the best unit in the game. Terran has Marines and Hellbats and Orbital Commands, I guess. Protoss has Cannons and Charge Knots. There is no other unit, besides Probes, which doesn't really count, that is just minerals. So, but it's quite good, and you warp in. This is where we put the Warp Prism in the S tier, because the ability to warp in between 2 and 200, okay, not 200, but probably like 25 at the upper end, Charge Knots, or DTs, well, probably not Stalkers, in their base at any point. Warp Prisms are required in order to play Protoss. Not in the same way that Queens are required for Zerg, but they're required in the sense that you pretty much, both for micro potential, with juggling in and out with either Colossi or Immortals or whatever, and also supporting every push. So, Warp Prisms are never going to go away, and thus are the core of Protoss. Swarm House. There would have been a time I put in the C tier. It is not this time. The Swarm Hosts have a place. I don't think they're even reaching situational, but you can find a scenario for them. Sometimes it feels like they're pigeonholed into the mid-game of Protoss versus Zerg. We've seen Dark occasionally try to use them against Terran. They work okay against Mech. It's just they have a lot of clear counters, and they aren't the Swarm Hosts of old, the Endless Siege. They're a wave-based attack unit, and if you don't use it on every wave well, you're just left with 30, 40, 80 supply that can't do anything. So, their glaring weaknesses keep them from being any higher up, which I think is also true for the Tempest. I think the Tempest... No, I gotta move it up a little. The Tempest is being seen more and more as a reliable late-game unit for taking out Lurkers, Liberators, Siege Tanks. It requires a lot more finesse than the Carrier, but it's relatively cheap and microable. In fact, it has gotten some arguable buffs in the last couple patches. So, the tectonic destabilizers have been in the game for a while, but the acceleration is increased, so it's more microable than it once was. This doesn't increase its damage or anything, but the effectiveness of the unit and the ability to use it overall, I think, is being seen more and more. So, it's the best for the anti-siege role that Protoss has, far better than the Carrier, but less of a I'm building this every game sort of unit. Now, Thor, I think, follows in that same role, partially as a counter to the Tempest. Does it fit, though? No. There are better options. There are Ghosts, there are Vikings, there are Liberators. The Thor goes down with the Battlecruiser in being a great option for A-moving across the map. But, no, I take it back. Now I feel like I should put the Battlecruiser up. Now I'm redebating. The Thor and the Battlecruiser are incredible late-game options. But there's so much startup cost, and they're so involved, and they have such clear counters in the form of Neural Parasite, and to an extent Tempest. Yeah, alright, I'm comfortable with B tier for Bronze League heroes. The B tier are units that Bronze League heroes think are amazing or OP, but have very clear counters if you have more than 60 APM. Which is why the Ultra joins them. The Ultra... So, the Ultralisk has gone on a diet. It now costs less. It unburrows faster. It's literally smaller. But it more reliably can latch onto a target to attack. So, the Ultra can fill the role of meat shield in many scenarios. It's a closer sort of unit that is found in a lot of those late game scenarios. But you can't fill out your army with Ultras and expect it to work in the long term. You might be able to win the game straight up with them, but they have an expiration date if your opponent isn't taken out. So they just aren't as intimidating as they maybe once were. Though, as Hydra once said, when I'm really far ahead and I want to lose, I make Ultras. And that's still kind of true in many scenarios. The Viking. Amazing. So the Viking was actually buffed to be more microable. About a year ago, its damage point was reduced to 0.04, which means essentially the moment you tell it to attack something, it fires those missiles and you can micro again. That's why players like Clem are able to get so much out of it. And it can land, and it successfully will 1v1 a Stalker. Not so great against Zerg, but you'll still see a couple. You're never going to regret having some Vikings in your army composition. It's a core part of the army against Terran. It can be good against Zerg, and it's solid against Protoss and used in many late-game compositions. So I think it clearly goes in that category. Now, probably our last S-tier unit, the Viper. The Viper, not quite as critical as the Queen, but the Viper is the late-game unit for Zerg. You might notice the Ultra and the Broodlord are having a tough time. The Ultra and the Broodlord are brought up to a solid A, or maybe even S tier, by combining them with the Viper. We're just judging them on their own here, but the Viper is the crowbar, the battering ram, the screwdriver. It is exactly what you need in order to dismantle most unit compositions that don't involve ghosts. Between Parasitic Bomb, all three abilities, Abduct, Parasitic Bomb, and Blinding Cloud, have their place, and you almost always want at least a couple more of them than you're able to get. The Viper, slightly buffed to do less damage on consume, though that's not particularly relevant. But at the end of the day, the Viper is still the unit you'll see Zergs building the moment a hive finishes. So that should tell you how strong it is and how common. The Zergling. First, the Void Ray. The Void Ray, how far it has fallen. Now, you might not believe me if you only play 4v4, but the Void Ray for several years was a menace. Because before Blizzard decided to take StarCraft 2 behind the woodshed, and we slithered out of its clutches, they buffed it to cost less, build faster, and move faster. Just a buff across the board. But most of that was reverted with the Balance Council as proxy Void Ray and early Void Ray timings, and Void Rays as a core part of the army. The problem was, it overlapped heavily with the other Stargate units' roles, and it did it so well, it just replaced them. But now, because they're just better, it's not so much a C-tier unit, I think, as it's particularly bad. It's that almost always, when you look at your Stargate, you want to build a different unit. You don't look at it and say, I want Void Rays. You might, but like Hero or Max Pax is not out here building more than maybe one Void Ray in the early game, and usually that's part of a cheesy other sort of build. But now, the Zergling. Alright, last but very much not least, the Zergling, still one of the best. You build it in every game, you almost always want more. It becomes Banelings. It gets incredible scaling from upgrades. I think this is a bit of bias. I think it's A tier, but I'm putting it in S tier because it looks bad to only have one Zerg unit. And top Zerg players do absolutely magical things with Zerglings. It isn't nearly as directly impactful as the Viper, but you'll see hundreds, if not literally thousands, in a singular game. I think it has some strengths that the Zealot doesn't. The Zealot doesn't have any super late game scaling. Adrenal Glands is a massive damage increase. It makes the Zergling incredibly effective against anything that doesn't have splash damage. And it's a great mineral sink as well. And Zerg usually have a lot of minerals to go around. So while it's not, as well as being able to morph into Banelings, which we've already established are good, situational, but almost always pretty good. So, one last once over. Now, all the units in StarCraft 2. This took a little longer than I expected. Well, Brenda, top tier. Best unit in the game, if only because of how critical she is for... If I could put 10 queens on that, if I had a way to figure that out, I would do that. Just imagine there are 10 queens on the top row. The S tier, Orbital Command. Because there's no reason not to have more of it. Doesn't cost supply. Makes mules. Then we have our workers. Ghosts, Marines, and Medivacs. You see them pretty much every game, especially the ghosts. And they're something that you almost always want to have a solid amount of. Probably more than you have right now. Vipers and Zerglings. Vipers, the late game spellcaster for Zerg. Far over the Infestor. And Zerglings, because they're one of the more efficient mineral sinks outside of Queens. For Protons, the Warp Prism and the Oracle are both critical components of any sort of Protons composition overall. Like, if you don't have them, you're missing key parts, whether it's detection or reinforcements or the ability to warp in and backstab and drag attention, stuff like that. A tier, Siege Tank, Marauder, Viking, Liberator, Banshee, and Missile Turret. All just solid core units. Probably not the highlight of your composition, but certainly a strong appetizer. Or, like, the entree itself. As those are the units that are going to help you punch through and do so pretty reliably. Not the missile turret, but you get the idea. Whereas for Zerg, Overlord, Infestor, Roach, Ravager, Hydra. These core parts of the army that individually you don't want to mass up. Too many of them usually, maybe not Hydras or Roaches, depends, but are still strong options. And now pretty much half the Protoss roster. A lot of very good units that don't quite reach S tier because they all have such clear counters. The Nexus and the Shield Battery don't quite have the... You don't see people building 10 Nexi in their main base to have extra Chrono Boost energy in the late game, let's be honest here. Archons and Immortals and Chargelons are always going to be your core army composition. Always good, just need to be filled in with some extra spice. Whether it's carriers, Templar, sentries, disruptors, or stalkers. Those, I think, all count in that category. And then your situational options. The Reapers, the Bunker, Hellions, Hellbats, Ravens, and Cyclones. Which, things all good at their mostly early game roles, or very late game, in the case of Hellbats and Ravens. Same with the Zerg options. Nidus, Lurker, Baneling, and Changeling. Well, the Changeling's kind of the odd man out here, but all very good, or a way to throw the game. Take your pick. Meanwhile, for Protons, you got your Mothership, your Photon Cannon, Tempest, Colossi, and Adepts. All fill their role. Probably the odd one out here is the Cannon, as usually you want some of them, but I'm kind of more thinking massing up cannons or using them as a core part, either in the late game or for defense. And then in the B tier, the can work, but probably not a common option and requires a relatively specific scenario. Planetary Fortress, I think, is less of that, but more the fact that the opportunity cost of not being an orbital command is what drives it down to this level. The Battlecruiser and the Thor are both ridiculously strong, but also quite weak when prepared for. So the auto turret's also here. Widowmine has fallen from its disgusting pedestal to being just pretty good. Broodlord, Swarmhost, Mutas, and Ultras all have their place, but usually their place is in the Units Lost tab. Overseers, Corruptors, and Spores are all necessary evils that feel quite costly, even though you have to build them in many scenarios. And then the niche Protoss units of Phoenixes and Dark Templar are fragile glass cannons that are easily countered. The Observer is not bad, it's just Oracles are better. So I think that, much like the Planetary, gets pushed down a little. And then the Spine Crawler, which eats my drones and does very little in return if you're not cheesing. Same with the Void Ray, which eats my minerals and gas and does very little in return if you're not cheesing. And remember, these are all at the pro level. We're assuming you got at least 350 APM, about 350 at least, in order to really utilize these units to near or at their fullest potential. So, this isn't the you're a noob, here are units to build sort of guide. This isn't supposed to be necessarily for me or you, but where the units are, and hopefully a bit of an explanation of why they're there at this day and this age and this decade of StarCraft 2. So, what do you think? Do you agree or are you wrong? Leave a comment, like, subscribe, and, well, if you haven't yet checked out Patreon or YouTube membership, it'd be awesome if you could do so. If you got the means of motivation. Otherwise, check out the second channel. No, we're going to go back. Jimmy. Okay. I'll keep that up there. But, yeah, that took a little longer than I expected. But I'm still pretty satisfied with it. So that's what she said. Thank you. Good luck. I'll see you next time for something maybe a bit more typical. But good luck. Have fun. Thank you for watching. I hope I made your day a little bit better. Stay chill.